right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Drink, Fish, Swim. During this session, we are going to talk about what science says about local water quality, what the law says about protecting water quality, and what is threatening our water quality. So we're really at that intersection between science and policy. My name is Ellen Kohler. I am from the University of Maryland's Environmental Finance Center. Our other panelists are Alan Hunt from the Musconetcong Watershed Association and Nancy Lawler from the Musconetcong Watershed Association. The Musconetcong Watershed Association is dedicated to protecting and improving the quality of the Musconetcong River and its watershed, including its natural and cultural resources. And the Environmental Finance Center is one of 10 university-based centers across the country that provides communities with the tools and information necessary to manage change for a healthy environment and to enhance local quality of life. So, next slide. So we're going to start off with an activity. How do we use our local water quality? So if in the chat, in the session chat, so if you go to the right-hand side, we should be able to click on chat, and then there's a choice in there of event or session, and if you pick session, if you can enter into the chat for us what your local watershed is and how you use your local watershed, that would be great. We'll give you a couple seconds here to do that. Meanwhile, other people maybe are joining in, which is great. But I'm not seeing anybody enter anything in about their watershed yet. Oh, there we go. Excellent. Okay, I'll give everybody a couple more minutes here. Entering in your local watershed and how you use it, your local waterway and how you use it. Okay. So what we really want to be focusing on is how do we make sure the water in our watershed stays clean enough for all of our needs, all the different kinds of ways we want to use the water. Sometimes it takes a crisis to get people to take action. This is a picture from Finesville of some flooding that resulted in the community being willing to consider how to remove a dam. And then there are other larger scale disasters. This is the Cuyahoga River, which caught on fire multiple times and was sort of the visual impetus for the passing of the Clean Water Act in the early 70s. So turning to the Clean Water Act, that's really what we want to focus on today, is how does the Clean Water Act help us take action to protect water quality? It was passed in 1972. Its objective is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters, and doing that by eliminating discharge of pollutants to surface water. And the text from the act that gets us to this idea of fishable, swimmable is this water quality, which provides for, we're supposed to be aiming for water quality, which provides for protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and provides for recreation in and on the water. So our waterways are supposed to be fishable and swimmable. That's the goal of the Clean Water Act. How do we do that? So the Clean Water Act sets up a system where each state or tribe, as a sovereign entity, determines its own water quality goals. So here's the real nuts and bolts of the Clean Water Act, the water quality standards. Those water quality, the states set water quality standards across all their rivers and streams and lakes. And then they conduct monitoring of those waterways to see if those waterways are meeting those standards. If they are meeting those water quality standards, then the next step is for them to make sure that they do not, that any actions taken do not further degrade water quality. That's applying the anti-degradation policy. And we'll get into that a little bit more in a second. If when they monitor, they find that those waterways are not meeting water quality standards, then that's called, those waterways are considered as impaired or unattaining. And they go onto this list called the 303D list, which is the waters that are not attaining. And each state has to report to EPA every 2 years about which waterways are not attaining in their state. And that's called the integrated report and 303D list. So it's an assessment of how they're doing in their state and where we have problems. Once a waterway is determined to not be meeting the water quality standards, to be impaired, one of the strategies used to address that problem is to develop what's called a total maximum daily load, a TMDL. And then from there, we take the other actions that you take under the Clean Water Act include issuing permits, and making sure those water quality standards and those limits that are spelled out in the daily load or TMDL are implemented in those permits. So that could be a point source permit, which is what's called a NPDES permit, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit. It could be a 404 permit, which is a wetland permit. Another way to take action is through the Section 319 plans, which address more of the kinds of challenges that we have around non-point source pollution. Section 404 helps states make sure that when the federal government takes action, that the federal government is complying with the state's water quality standards. And finally, there's the State Revolving Fund, which provides resources from the federal government that are matched by the state to implement strategies to address, to clean up waterways. So that often is used, for example, in the past, it's been used to upgrade wastewater treatment plants so that there's not as much pollution going into the streams. So there are different places in this whole system where we as the public can come in and either contribute comments or contribute data. So for example, when the state's looking at the monitoring, that's obviously collecting data, and volunteer data can be used by the state either to just get a baseline of what's going on, or if it's really high quality data, they can use it in their assessment protocols. You can also comment on how they do their assessment in the 303 process. You can comment on which streams they have listed as being attaining or not attaining. You can participate in the development of a TMDL. You can comment on permits. You can participate in the Section 319 planning processes. So there are lots of places for the public to be engaged in the Clean Water Act and how it functions in your state. So I want to take just a couple more minutes to focus in on the water quality standards. There are three elements to water quality standards. The first element is designated uses. Those are the goals that we have for those waterways. What do we want to be able to use those waterways for? The second is the criteria, and these criteria can be either numeric or narrative. And then the third element of our water quality standards is the anti-degradation policy. Now, in practice, often the EPA will draft criteria and the state water quality criteria, and the state reviews them and often just adopts what the EPA has put together. Under the statute, the state can be more restrictive. It could adopt a water quality standard that is more restrictive than what the EPA is recommending, but it cannot be less restrictive than what the EPA is recommending. And each state is supposed to review their water quality standards every 3 years in something called the triennial review. So to look a little bit more closely at those three elements, designated uses, all states have to define their designated uses, and they have to include something about fishable and something about swimmable. So most of them include they want to be able to use their water for drinking water, for industrial uses, for what's called primary contact recreation, which is really about swimming, the kind of recreation where you might get water in your mouth and ingest it. Secondary contact recreation, where you're standing in it but probably aren't likely to get it into your mouth. And then designated uses for fish, aquatic life, and wildlife. Again, these are the goals, what we want those waterways to be used for. Then the second element is water quality criteria. There are two kinds of water quality criteria. There are numeric, which are measurable benchmarks. So things like, we want this waterway to have no more than 0.1 milligrams per liter of phosphorus. For example, there's a number you can get, take a sample and measure and see if the water is meeting that numeric standard. There are also narrative criteria, and these define desirable conditions. They're sometimes they're called the free froms. So you want a waterway to be free from trash or free from odor. And so these define a state, but don't have a numeric standard that you're trying to reach. And these criteria fall into three kinds of categories. They can address biological conditions in the stream, chemical conditions, or physical conditions. The final element of the water quality standards is this anti-degradation policy. So the whole purpose of the Clean Water Act was to make sure that our water quality didn't get any worse than it was when the statute was passed. And but also to make sure that we're keeping healthy waters healthy and improving water quality for waterways that were pretty polluted. So the anti-degradation policy's goal is to keep those healthy waters healthy. So there are three levels of protection. Existing uses. So every waterway has to have its current existing uses, what it is currently being used for. That water quality, it has to be maintained so that those uses can still be pursued. So that water quality has to be at least at the level to pursue those existing uses. Then those high quality waters, when you find those high quality waters and they're so designated in your states, under your state's anti-degradation policy, then in those waterways, you have to consider, if there's a new discharge being proposed, you have to consider a no discharge alternative. And the only way you're allowed to have a new discharge is if you can make a socioeconomic justification, a discharge that might degrade water quality, excuse me. You have to have some kind of justification for why that degradation is really required or needed. And finally, the third category of waters is our outstanding waters. And in these waters, this highest level in the anti-degradation policy, you're not going to have any new discharges at all. There can be nothing that degrades those outstanding waterways. So with that sort of deep dive, looking at those water quality standards, which are really the guts of the Clean Water Act, that's how it applies across the whole country at the federal level. Alan's now going to take a look at how this plays out in New Jersey with the New Jersey standards, and then Nancy's going to look very closely at what we know about the Musconetcong. Alan?
Great, thanks, Ellen. Next slide. So the Clean Water Act is an example of what folks call cooperative federalism. It's where the federal government sets the standards, the goals, the processes. Each state has this opportunity to kind of customize its approach with implementing the Clean Water Act. So some of the terms and some of the approaches that New Jersey uses are unique to New Jersey. So we're going to take a look at some of those. So you're going to see some of the terms here that Ellen was talking about that come from the Clean Water Act, and they'll be referenced throughout the presentation. So this information, so you know, is being pulled from the Surface Water Quality Standard rules and the Groundwater Quality Standard rules. There's links to them here, and also the Water Quality Management Plan rules in New Jersey. So in New Jersey, we have the designated uses, as Ellen mentioned, the water quality criteria, and the anti-degradation standards. And we have the integrated quality assessment reports for the monitoring and assessment, just like the Clean Water Act describes. In New Jersey, we're primarily looking at water quality and habitat for determining how good the water is. Our anti-degradation standards are informed by those water quality parameters, and that's when we get to things like Category 1 or Category 2. When we get to discharge permitting, continuing to go down the column here, what's supposed to happen is you're supposed to take into account all these different things. You're supposed to take into account the use. If the discharge would impair the use, you're not supposed to have that new discharge, or you may be looking at ways to reduce a discharge that's existing to meet that use. You're looking at the water quality criteria to set how much pollutant is allowed. And the anti-degradation standard, again, goes back to what your tolerance is, what your goal is around this. So you take all this into account. When you get to non-point source pollution, stuff that's not from a pipe, then there's different approaches. And you're looking to see, is the use impaired? Is the water quality saying that the goal that we've set can't be met? And if it can't be met, then it goes on to a list called the Dirty Waters List 303D. And there's potentially grants to address the pollution. And one of the key goals here is that you're not, when you do a discharge permit, you're trying not to make that background pollution, that non-point pollution, worse. So that's kind of the overview. That's where we're going. And next slide. So why does all this matter? So if you care about recreation, people getting in the water for whatever reason, that's one of the key human uses that we care about at the Watershed Association. So you have this question: are we meeting that use, and how do we know? So the integrated water quality assessments tell us that. We've got these two different levels: FW2 in New Jersey that includes the industrial and agriculture, primary contact, etc. uses. FW1 limits discharges. And if you're not meeting that use, like in this map from 2008, much of the state doesn't meet recreational use because of bacteria contamination largely, then you're supposed to come up with a plan for addressing it or recommendations about how to address it. One key thing to point out here is that our coastal waters do attain recreational standards, and a large number of our watersheds are not assessed. About a third are not assessed. Next. So how do you tell if the water is good enough for what you want to use it for? So DEP does do these integrated water quality assessments. And if you go check out the link on the bottom corner of the page here, you can get more information about how they do that, when they do that, where they do that. In general, they're looking for two things. Is this an exception? What's the ecological significance of this water that's being measured? And what's the fishery significance? So ecology would be things like water chemistry, macroinvertebrate habitat, impervious coverage. What else is going on, that they see with mapping resources? And in our state, we use trout as our indicator species for a whole host of these parameters too. So that's why we're looking at fishery significance. If you're in a coastal area, shellfish harvesting is one of the key criteria, but we're focusing on inland waters. And then you may have seen this, that there's our state calls them surface water classification. So this is only our state's way of doing it, not Pennsylvania's, not New York's. We have that FW1, and then we have the FW2 use. And then we add a further classification around whether there's trout, whether trout can maintain, but maybe it's not cold enough to reproduce, and trout production. That's the highest standard for the FW2. Next. So if you wanted to find out some of this information yourself, where can you go? Oh, my slide's not advanced yet. Is it just? Good, thank you. So I mentioned the integrated water quality assessments. So there's, you can link to that off of here. This is the most recent one for the state, 2016. There's also a pretty good online mapping software. You just access it, called New Jersey GeoWeb. It's through your browser, and it can show you things like where the monitoring sites are. That's called AMNet. It's an acronym. And if there's not too many sites on a single river, but you can find it. And like on the map here, you can see that there's a ranking, excellent to no data. And also the Fish Index of Biotic Integrity. There's also rankings there for that. Next. So that's kind of the overview of this and where you can find information. So for our audience today, thinking through, well, why does this all matter to me? So we talked a little bit about recreation. Well, let's say you're interested about restoring a river's or a lake's water quality. How does this all relate to you? So if you're thinking about non-point pollution, stuff that's not end of pipe, that's like lawn runoff, roadside runoff, backyards, farm runoff, that type of stuff. So what you're trying to do here is some of that assessment data will tell you there's an issue. If the issue is significant enough, it goes on the 303D list, the dirty water list, and then it goes to the TMDL, total maximum daily load, if they develop one at DEP. And the goal here is sets the restoration goal. If we reduce this pollution by X%, then we will be attaining the use. And there's funding from the Clean Water Act to help support that. It comes through a section called 319H, and you can learn more about it from DEP. If you think about the map we saw earlier about recreational use, about the number of small watersheds that have impairments, if you look at this map, this is where the 319 grants have gone to develop plans for restoration. It's a much smaller subset of watersheds and subwatersheds that actually have have had the resources and have competed successfully for restoration planning. The key thing there is with one of those plans that unlocks other restoration funds to improve the water quality. Next, please. So if you're looking at this from a different perspective about a point source, let's say you're concerned about maybe a wastewater treatment plant or an industrial discharger, or maybe a new proposed discharge, how would you find out information about that? Well, here's a good map from Environment New Jersey, and interactive map. Again, you can click on these different sites and learn more information about their permits. There's also a DEP website where you can learn about that. It's not as easy to use. And one thing to think of about point sources is it excludes septic systems of 2,000 gallons or less. They're considered non-point for the purposes of the Clean Water Act. And it includes agriculture runoff, roadside runoff, lawn runoff, things like that. Next slide. So when DEP decides, do I renew a permit? Do I need to take enforcement action on a permit? Do I allow a new permit? This is what's supposed to happen in terms of the information to decide what to do. So you look at the use. The FW1 has its goal of being set aside for posterity. So most of the pinelands is FW1, primary contact recreation and habitat. But if there's other uses that already have a permit, they can continue. It doesn't allow a new discharge though. FW2 is what everything else is in the state. It's industrial, agricultural, water supply, still primary contact recreation and habitat. Then the state looks at temperature. So this is where the no trout, trout maintenance, trout production comes in. So if you're an angler and you look at these temperatures here, even if you're at FW2 trout production, there's still some variance allowed in the background temperature for a discharge, 6 degrees centigrade. If there's no trout, you're looking at 2.8 degrees centigrade. So you have to think about what's the seasonality of the temperature on that stretch of river. How would this discharge affect it, or how does it currently affect it? And then the anti-degradation standards are how much degradation is allowed. And in New Jersey, we have 3 levels. Category 2 is kind of the base level that waters start at. It can be degraded as long as that existing use is met. So if you've got good water quality and you can pollute it a little bit more but still meet the designated use, you can pollute up to that level. That's the idea there. Category 1 protects exceptional water. So remember, exceptional ecological or fishery significance, that's a metric in there. But it can still allow degradation for important economic and social concerns. So what would those be? Well, an important social concern might be wastewater treatment. What if you have a community that has a lot of septic systems and they need a community wastewater treatment system to address a pre-existing health issue with all those septic systems? Maybe that's justified on a C1 to have a new discharge for that. Or an economic concern could be the need for power generation and cooling water. The outstanding national resource water is a no degradation, no new discharges, and it's really the only thing that's close to a restoration standard here. So you have to think about, how is your water protected by this approach that DEP uses? Next. So if we sum up what New Jersey does, kind of what we do well and what we don't. Oh, we've got a different slide. Sorry, skipped one. So what makes a water exceptional? So in our state, it's currently ecological significance and its recreation and its fisheries resources. Our state does not look at recreational significance, and it's very limited around water supply significance. I think we need to be on a different slide. And then there's another aspect about anti-degradation standards that isn't accounted for in our state either. And we're supposed to be looking at scenic setting as well, but there's no rule or definition around what that means. The water supply only gets cut off at 100,000 people, and that's right by the intake. So the Highlands, even though the Highlands Planning Act was for protecting water supply, it doesn't have an equivalent protection to the Pinelands, which is non-degradation. And then there's no definition for recreational significance. So if you have a wild and scenic river or a water trail or a national trail or a park, you know, like something we're going through Appalachian State Park, there's no way to take into account that recreational use because it's not defined. So let's go to the next slide. So it's giving you a little bit of a hint about where New Jersey is working well and where it could be improved. We do have established rules. As Ellen pointed out, we've got a public process. There's a lot of science done. We've got a lot of river miles, and this is what Nancy's going to talk about, what the state does and what volunteers can do in associations like ours to fill in the gaps, because they're not getting to all the watersheds, but they're getting to a lot. What's not so good, and it's a bit of a list here, and it's worth going through and keeping in mind that there were more monitoring sites, but they've declined over time. There's very few groundwater sites, like the Musconetcong, for being 46 miles long, has 2 groundwater monitoring sites. There's, I think, about 80 in the state, and we haven't even talked about groundwater here. So when you have connected groundwaters and surface waters like we have in carbonate rock or limestone areas, this is very important to understand, but not a lot of data for understanding it. We're seeing a lot of non-attainment for designated use, especially around recreation, and there's not enough money to restore all the rivers to their designated use. The anti-degradation standards don't account for the recreational resources. They don't account for water supplies less than 100,000. This is something I recently found out. Our standards in New Jersey for anti-degradation are less than the Delaware River. So we're sending all this water down to the Delaware River, and the Delaware River Basin's managing for primary contact recreation, and New Jersey's not necessarily looking at that for discharge. And I mentioned that there's a number of blind spots in our system, and it could be better. So what could you do? Well, you can be an advocate. We're starting a campaign called the Great Waters Campaign, and if you want to learn more about that, send an email. We're definitely looking for advocates at the municipal level to talk with municipal officials or county officials. So if you're on the Environmental Commission or the Planning Board, or you would like to be more connected, let us know. We'll help connect you. You can join a local environmental commission, and the Association of New Jersey Environmental Commissions is a sponsor of this event. The link here gets to how to form environmental commission and a directory of where they are. You can join the planning board or the zoning or land use board. Where you live, it's a different name for those. Go to your municipal meetings. That's where a lot of these local decisions they're made, but also where we first learn of a proposed development or change for a permit. And look at maps like GeoWeb. That's how I got started. I love looking at maps, and I got really curious about, what was going on, what these things mean. If you see a violation or potential violation, the first person observer who noticed that should call DEP, and it can help monitor the water. So Nancy here is going to talk to you more about what this all means when you get down to the watershed level, what DEP does, what associations like ours do, what volunteers can do, and what our partners like universities can do to help learn more about the water quality and help protect it.
Hi. So today I'm going to talk about water monitoring and about the Musconetcong. So the first thing that we want to know is, what does the state do to monitor the Musconetcong River? So it has these AMNAT sites that monitor the ambient conditions on the river, and they're on a 5-year cycle. So that's not very often. They do chemical testing about 4 times a year. And there's other monitoring that's done periodically. Fish tissue sampling, which is important to determine whether there's you can consume the fish, and there's sediment sampling. For lakes, they're also on a 5-year cycle, and private lakes, where there's homeowners associations, lake owners associations, they are on, they usually do annual monitoring, but they hire private consultants. So what does all this information they collect mean locally? Next. So first we're going to look up at the top of the watershed at Lake Pakkong. Lake Pakkong does not meet its designated use for aquatic life. Sometimes it meets its designated use for swimming in beach areas. It absolutely does not meet fish consumption, designated use, nor public water supply. And that's due to problematic pH, mercury, PCBs, and phosphorus. And those are due to stormwater runoff and atmospheric deposition. The atmospheric deposition, of course, is the mercury source. It does meet its designated use for agriculture and industrial uses. Next. When we go into the Hackettstown area, the river also does not meet its public water supply use. It doesn't meet its aquatic life trout use, and it doesn't meet its fish consumption use, and it doesn't meet its recreational use. And those are due to arsenic, temperature, and E. coli issues. There is a TMDL for arsenic and E. coli in this section, and those are due to urban and ag stormwater runoff, and also the geology in this area has naturally occurring arsenic that's at very low levels, but it doesn't meet the criteria for that. Again, the river does meet agricultural and industrial uses. Next. When we go into the lower Musconetcong, again, doesn't meet public water supply use. It does not meet its swimming use. And those are due, again, to arsenic and bacteria. There's a bacteria TMDL. Again, here, it's from geology and ag and septic runoff. It does meet its agricultural, industrial, and aquatic life use. So, next, are we protecting water quality? You'll think so in some cases. There are challenges, next slide, in New Jersey. Remember that Alan mentioned there's 6,450 river miles in New Jersey. We are supposed to be at build out. Remember, we're a very dense state. By 2040, we should meet build out. There are always new and emerging problems, and non-point source pollution is much more of a problem in our watershed than and in New Jersey than point source is at this time. Next, climate change. We are a very wet state, and we are going to be getting wetter. Over the last 100 years, we've had a 5-inch average increase, and now we're getting to about 4 feet of precipitation. In 2018, we're still seeing that increasing. In Morris County, they received over 67 inches of precipitation that year. So that's what kind of problems does that create? Next, these new threats to the Musconetcong from precipitation increases. We have emerging contaminants. Everybody's heard about harmful algal blooms. We have PFAS that come from coatings from nonstick pans and other sources. We have infrastructure that's aging, that's very impacted by increases in precipitation. Septic systems are stressed. Dams are stressed. The increase in stormwater is creating more non-point source pollution. It's increasing flooding. You can see in the photograph, you see the lower Musconetcong after Hurricane Irene, which everybody remembers being a pretty serious event. The water affects roads and bridges, and also we have increases in temperature due to runoff from impervious surface. Next. So as Alan alluded, New Jersey DEP cannot do this alone. A small group of scientists at DEP cannot cover 6,450 river miles. So the way they do this in New Jersey is they actively solicit quality assured data to inform the 303D list. They ask nonprofits like MWA, private citizens can submit data, and local municipalities. They offer training through the Watershed Ambassador Program. MWA is a host agency for that program, and also the Watershed Network. The Watershed Institute has a grant from New Jersey DEP to offer facilitate data submission. The MWA is an active New Jersey DEP partner. We're a member of the New Jersey Water Quality Monitoring Council, and we often are asked to assist in monitoring, which we happily do when we can have the capacity, and we also submit project data. Next. So what kind of information does MWA collect and submit? We assess restoration effectiveness. We measure bacteria, sediments, and nutrients to make those assessments. We also do dam removal monitoring, which DEP does not do. In those cases, we look at sediment and biological shifts. And sometimes that data has very interesting outcomes. In this photograph, we had 2 volunteers find a fish called the slimy sculpin in a tributary that's not far from our office. This little slimy sculpin, it's a very sensitive little fish, and that finding contributed to that tributary receiving C1 designation. In 2018, we also were very interested in trying to figure out what the source was of the bacteria contamination in the lower Musconetcong. With the assistance of Montclair State, we repeated a study that was done by Rutgers in 2007, and we measured, the levels, and we used a new technique called qPCR to determine the source. And what we found was where our partners had encouraged farm conservation activities, there was lower bacteria, but in the areas where there was dense septic, the bacteria was increasing. And we're using that information to inform municipal action. We're we were applying for a grant to help them identify whether their water sources are at risk and help them come up with some planning. Next. Oops, I'm a little ahead. Next slide. Next, Ellen, and one more. So volunteers also collect data. Oops, I'm sorry, we're a little ahead. Can you go back 2 slides? Yeah. Volunteers also collect data. Our river watchers have been collecting data from 2007 to the present. We have more than 25 volunteers. They receive paraprofessional training from us. We monitor at sites from Lake Musconetcong to the confluence, and we share that data with municipalities. Next. And so what does that data show? Next. Well, in 2009, we found that sites in the upper watershed were too warm for trout. And we were very concerned about this and started to investigate using continuous monitoring devices, what was really going on there. Next. And we found, this is the readout from one of our sensors at Old Waterloo Road, which is right downstream of the Lake Musconetcong outfall. And I grabbed a screenshot of the summer temperatures from 2020. So this is just this past summer. And the red line you see above that temperature, which is about 21 degrees Celsius, about 70 degrees, trout cannot really survive all that well. And so this is a concern because, as you can see, almost the entire summer temperatures were higher than the trout criteria. Next. Downstream about 20 miles at Bloomsbury, the summer temperatures at our sensor down there showed that about half the time the temperatures were higher than the trout criteria. It's adequate for trout as long as they have refuges in cooler tributaries. So we were wondering, well, what's going on in the rest of the in the watershed where we really don't have these fancy sensors? Next. So this summer, we had the volunteers. I gave out thermometers to all the volunteers, and we had a one-day dip-in. Basically, what they did is on August 1st, everybody chose a site, and between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning, everybody measured the temperature at their site. So we had 16 volunteers, so we could look at 16 sites. And what you see here, just to give you a little way of interpreting this, the circles are sites on the main stem, and the squares are tributary sites. The red or pink indicate temperatures that are getting too warm for trout. The white indicate it's okay most of the time. And the blue indicate that it's likely that those sites are cold enough for trout throughout the year. So when we look at this, we can definitely see that there are areas that are problems and probably will never be able to support trout. But in the white areas, we have an opportunity to move those sites, maybe with restoration activities, maybe with extra trees or shade or something. We can move it from white to blue. And the blue areas we should look at very carefully and see if there are any other impediments to trout surviving. So it's a way of using that data for prioritizing restoration. Next. So our science says that the river is generally healthy, but the lake region has urbanization and stormwater effects. That includes salt. There's no TMDL for that. We have harmful algal blooms, which have caused big economic problems in the upper watershed, and we have these high temperatures. As we move into Hackettstown, it's the same thing. Increasing summer temperatures. There's no TMDL for temperature there, so we can't really work on that. Fecal bacteria contamination. We do have a TMDL, so we can work on that. And the Beatty's Mill and Newburgh dams have been targeted for removal. Beatty's Dam should come out in the next year. At Point Mountain, that area is preserved. We still have a bacteria contamination. We still have increased summer temperatures, no TMDL. And we also noticed this year we have increased use because everybody wants to visit it due to COVID-19, and we're not really sure what the impact to that area is going to be. In the lower Musconetcong, we have ongoing restoration. We have a mixed bacteria story. Still, the TMDL says what it says. We have been very happy to hear that shad have returned after the dam removals in the lower Musconetcong, but we have a new little invasive threat called the New Zealand mud snail, which is threatening biological condition there. And again, as Alan alluded to, we have very, very little data on our tributaries. Next, so we really need to do something about that. So what do our partners do to help restore the river? and protect it. They remove dams, they restore fish habitat, they help farmers reduce impacts. They bring more attention through the Musconetcong through the River Management Council and Trout Unlimited's Home Rivers Initiative. We actively participate in the Lake Pakkong Management Plan revisions that are about to start up again. The Highlands Act has been really great at slowing development, thanks to many of the work of our partners. And of course, there continues to be land preservation. So how can you help? Well, again, can't say it too many times, report problems to the DEP when you see them, limit products that contain PFAS that harm water quality. You can participate in MWA partner actions, such as reducing your lawn size. We've got a new initiative called Push Back the Lawn, increase your use of native species and plantings. Help us collect data through our River Watcher program. You can help us clean up the river during cleanups, become a member, protect to the tributaries and headwaters, support land and farm preservation efforts. Please visit us to learn more about that at musconetcong.org. You can also share your passion, knowledge, and skills by joining your environmental commission, and you can also represent your town on the MRMC. Next. And if you live in other watersheds, what can you do? Well, at your home and business, you can reduce the impacts of stormwater by planting trees and reducing lawn size, and increase your use of native species that use less water. Reduce impervious surfaces where you can. Always work to conserve water. For your town, share your passion and knowledge and skills by joining your environmental commission or open space and tree commissions. For nonprofits, they need you to become a member and share your knowledge. And we always encourage stewardship by encouraging people to have fun on the river, use your waterways, hike and fish and kayak and tube and canoe. Please always remember to carry in and carry out. It's become a problem this summer. And also, the rivers are incredible areas to see wildlife. Please bird watch along the river. Rivers are just amazing places to do that. Next. I think we're ready for your questions. And we have a few minutes, or we have about 5 minutes.
Yeah, so we did have a couple of questions in the chat. Thank you all very much, and my apologies for not doing the best job with the slides. It's a new platform for me, but we had a couple of questions, one about monitoring in terms of whether there are, let's go up here. We had one question about technology to be deployed in monitoring, and you did address that a little bit. I didn't know if you wanted to come back to that, Nancy, and just mention any other kinds of ways that you're using technology to monitor the rivers as opposed to always relying on human volunteers.
Yes, well, we have about 5 continuous monitoring sensors that are supported through an initiative through the Delaware River Watershed Initiative. They're called Enviro DIY sensors, and they do measure continuous temperature, depth, conductivity, and temperature. Did I mention that again? And they are great resources for information. If you look on our website, you can look at the data. It's publicly available.
Then there was another question about dams and whether dams are considered point sources. And Alan addressed that a little bit in the chat, but I thought it might be good to just pull that out to make sure everybody saw that. You want to address that, Alan?
Sure. So, dams do have an additional permitting process for them, and they go through the Bureau of Dam Safety in New Jersey. They do look at water quality issues around permits with them, but I don't think it's part of the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. I think it's more about the permitting because you're blocking a navigable water. So it's a slightly different approach. Ellen, is there anything you would want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly are places in the country where dams are part of the water quality picture. For example, in the Chesapeake, there is a watershed improvement plan for the Conowingo Dam. So that, depending on the size and scale and the issue at hand, yes, they can become part of the structure of the Clean Water Act in the context of them being a source of pollution, whether it's temperature or sediment loading or and other issues. So that might be something to be looking into, if you've got some dams that are particularly problematic in terms of the way that they interact with the stream and how it affects water quality. Mm-hmm. And then there was another question about the New Zealand mud snail and whether it's now widespread throughout the area and outside our watershed.
Yes, the snail has been found from at Bloomsbury and downstream to the Delaware, and it has gotten into the Delaware a little bit at the confluence. We don't have reports of any sightings in any other part of the state as yet, wow. But we really could use some assistance. Certainly the DEP would like to ask people to assist in looking to see whether, their monitoring has missed the spot. But no, the snail, we're unfortunately the first site where the snail has appeared in the state of New Jersey, but so far we haven't seen it migrate anywhere else.
And Nancy should also mention that we have a new grant to expand some of our monitoring efforts, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Are we going to need any, do you want to describe that to people and if there's any volunteer opportunities with that or internships?
Well, there are going to be some additional monitoring of the tributaries upstream of Bloomsbury. And if anybody is interested in learning more about the snail, assisting in monitoring, for that grant, we'd be happy. It's a great way. Monitoring is a great way to learn about these little critters and what they do to our stream. There will be an internships available for that and some of our other projects in the coming year.
Great. So that brings us to 10:10, and that's the supposed to be the end of the session. I don't see any other questions. So I want to thank you all for joining us, and thank you very much, Alan and Nancy. I always enjoy listening to you guys talk about the Musconetcong. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you, Alan.
And
bye-bye.
And we'll, enjoy the rest of the conference, everybody. Thank you very much.